Hello, I'm Professor Larry Swikart. I'm the co-author of Patriots' History of the United States with Michael Allen and the founder of the Wild World of History. Today's session is on the Articles of Confederation. The very best book on this is by Merrill Jensen called The Articles of Confederation. Jensen revised almost 100 years' worth of scholarship on the Articles of Confederation that Mike and I refer to as Chaos and Patriots to the Rescue. It was a common view that the Articles were so chaotic, so inept, so incapable of governing the early American United States that the Patriots, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, had to ride in and save the nation. Now, there's some truth to that, but as Jensen shows, the real story is a little more detailed. The Articles were signed on November 15, 1777, after independence, as an agreement or a constitution for the governance of these new states. The emphasis was on independence and sovereignty of these states. However, in fact, the Articles of Confederation had been governing the American colonies ever since the Declaration of Independence. It was what Congress was using to govern these young United States. It wasn't officially ratified until 1781 in February. So what did the Articles do? First and foremost, they established something called the United States of America. We actually had a name for our country. Second, it emphasized that the states were sovereign, that all power was delegated. Each state got one vote. Now, this was a big deal for the very populous states like Virginia and New York, compared to the little states like Rhode Island and Delaware, would later become a sticking point in the American Constitution, in which we had the large state plan and the small state plan, and these interests had to be balanced. But in the Articles, each state only gets one vote. Third, the purpose was mutual welfare and defense. Fourth, it established a freedom of movement between the states and extradition. Later, this will be called something called comity, in which one state will observe and recognize the practices and laws of another state to the degree that is possible. It allows us today, for example, to get married in one state and then to move with our spouse to another state and still be married. There were no national taxes. All revenues were to be paid by the states. And this, of course, is going to become a problem in itself because it's very hard to fund anything without a national tax. The Articles of Confederation Congress could declare war and establish post offices. Congress had a president within the Congress, but there was no office of a president, no co-equal branch of government. 9 of the 13 states had to agree to declare war or enter into a treaty. The declared articles could only be amended by ratification of all states. Now that's going to be proven to be a difficult issue when we get to the U.S. Constitution, because the very first thing that happens in the Constitutional Convention is that the founders knew that the Articles could not be amended by unanimous consent if everything was out in public. And so their very first act in the Constitutional Convention was to make everything secret and have everything held indoors. And their second act was to just get rid of the Articles of Confederation and say they aren't working, we need a totally new document. Now, both of these were requiring unanimous votes, right? The Continental Congress was to be the governing agent of the new United States of America. There was no executive and no national judiciary. This is what we call a very Whig view, W-H-I-G. The English Whigs were of the belief that Parliament should run the country, not the king or his ministers. That Parliament should decide things. This is the Whig concept of government. And indeed, in the early American colonies, the state assemblies had a great deal of power and were constantly chafing against the governors. So the Articles of Confederation is the extreme Whig concept of government. Now, where Jensen is absolutely correct is that the Articles of Confederation Congress did have some very important achievements in their very short life. The two most important were the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Both of these spoke to a very important concept that we had what were called landed colonies, such as Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia, that in theory stretched all the way out to the Mississippi River, and especially after the Louisiana Purchase, past the Mississippi and possibly all the way to the other end of the continent. Did North Carolina or Virginia or Pennsylvania own all of that land? Who did own it? Well, immediately after the Revolution, at the suggestion of Thomas Jefferson, and most of these ideas are Jefferson's, the landed states gave up their claim to the extended territory beyond their own colonial borders and handed that over to the Articles of Confederation Congress. So what did they do with this land? Well, it's an amazing story. In the Land Ordinance of 1785, they made allowances for ordinary people to go out and settle in these new areas. The most important of these areas was called the Old Northwest, which consisted of Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And they were going to allow people to move out there and settle. But they wanted to make sure the settlement was orderly, mainly for purposes of defense against the Indians. So they set up, in the Land Ordinance, a system of surveys. They started around the Portsmouth, Ohio area and moved westward. In these surveys, they would set up sections and townships. Okay, you would have 36 sections within a township. Each section was 1 square mile. And so it was estimated you'd get a number of people settling in each section of, say, Section 1. Then you would open up Section 2 for settlement, then Section 3, and so on and so forth. You did not want to have somebody settling in Section 36 while you were still trying to settle Section 1, again, because of purposes of defense against Indians. But we're Americans. No government's going to tell me what to do. And almost immediately, people began moving out into these other sections that hadn't been surveyed yet. This brought the Articles of Confederation Congress into its first crisis. What do you do with common law that says that the people know what they're doing, that they set up the laws, and that the government should follow the will of the people? Will of the people was very clearly that they be allowed to go out and settle in these more distant areas. But you had the government saying, with these property rights laws, no, you can only acquire property if we allow you to have it. So who won? The people won. Congress backed down and passed a law called preemption, or squatters' rights, that said if you go settle on a piece of land, even if it hasn't yet been surveyed by the government, and you stay there for 7 years, and you build something on it, it has to be a farmhouse or a farm. It can't be like a little log cabin thing, right? You stay there 7 years, that land is yours. And you are allowed by law of Congress to go out and to establish yourself a title deed. You would mark it off yourself. Usually these look jagged and irregular, where Farmer Jones would say, well, my land runs down to the clump of trees over there, down to that big rock, over to the river, and back up to the foot of the mountain, then over that clump of trees. And it'd be kind of an odd-shaped piece of land. But that's what he would draw and take it into a government office, and they would stamp it as officially certified, and he would have a title deed to that land. That all is contained within the Land Ordinance of 1785. It's the precursor to the Northwest Ordinance, which was equally important in 1787. Again, these are the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, though he wrote neither of these laws. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 said that the people of these territories, remember we're looking at modern day Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The people who moved into this Northwest territory had to be afforded the right to become U.S. citizens. Jefferson did not want to see these new lands develop, take on a character of their own, and say to us what we said to Great Britain. You don't represent us, we're going to go independent. We're going to declare independence and create our own state. How do you keep these new areas in the Union? So the plan was as follows. When you got 5,000 people in one of these so-called territories, they could apply for territorial status to Congress. They could submit a petition to Congress. Say there's 5,000 of us, we want to be a territory. If Congress approved their petition, you would get a territory, let's say the territory of Ohio, in which you got a territorial governor appointed by Congress, a territorial judge who would ride the circuit around the state and make judicial rulings all over the state, and a U.S. Marshal appointed to keep order. When your population reached 80,000, now the territory could apply for statehood. And the process was you would draft a constitution that you would then submit to Congress. If Congress approved the state constitution for Ohio, Ohio would come in immediately with 2 U.S. senators appointed by the state legislature and House of Representative members elected by the people of that territory. Now, how many House members did each territory get? No matter what your population, you got 1 at least. But the rest of it would depend on population, and they had a system for measuring how many people to each representative at the time. And so the next question was, how many states will we allow to come out of this Northwest territory? Again, for the third time, we're talking about Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. How many states would come out of that old Northwest? Well, the Articles of Confederation Congress was absolutely brilliant. I don't know how they foresaw this, but they said no fewer than 3 states must be formed out of that territory and no more than 5. And that's exactly what we got, 5 states. Now think of how brilliant that was. Because if you were to allow 1 state to come into the Union that encompassed Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana, it would only have 2 senators. But think of it in today's terms. You would have the population of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. It would be equal to or surpass maybe that of Texas or Florida or come close to that of California. But, so it would dominate, for example, the House of Representatives. But if you allowed 20 states to come out of this old Northwest, you would have a number of states like Rhode Island that would only have a couple of representatives each. But you would have 40 U.S. senators. Instead of dominating the House the way the other model would, this would dominate the U.S. Senate. What's so ingenious about this? Folks, the House and the Senate hadn't been created yet. They aren't created until the American Constitution is ratified. How did they know that we would have a Senate that could be dominated by a bunch of little states or a House that could be dominated by a single gigantic state? I don't know. This is the genius of the founders. They just said, wait a minute, something's wrong. We need to make sure we don't have states that are too big or too small. So that's the Land Ordinance of 1787. And a final point on the Land Ordinance. It made these people citizens again, so in Jefferson's scenario, they didn't decide to become independent. Why would they want to be independent? They had the same rights as the original 13 colonies. Name me one other nation in human history that as it extended its boundaries to conquered areas or acquired areas, it gave them the same essential rights as the mother country. Did England do this with Jamaica or Bermuda? Did France do this with Algeria? No. No other nation in human history has ever made those who it acquired or conquered or settled new population areas, made them equal citizens. Nobody has ever done that. So what were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? First, we've already mentioned this, revenue raising. There was no national tax collection policy. It had to all come from the states. Second, national defense was slow and sluggish. If you have to always call on state militias, some are going to be slow to respond, and if you've got a real emergency, it's going to be a problem. This was shown in Shays' Rebellion of 1786, caused by former soldiers who hadn't been paid by the Continental Congress. It started in Massachusetts, where Daniel Shays led a rebellion, and they went out and shut down courts beginning in Springfield, but it started to spread all over Massachusetts. Congress appointed or allowed Governor Bedoin in Massachusetts to hire his own private army. It was funded by Boston businessmen, and they sent over 4,000 soldiers under General Benjamin Lincoln out to put down the rebellion. Lincoln's men scattered the rebels, a few were captured, paraded to the gallows, and then set free. Daniel Shays himself was pardoned. Only 2 of the rebels were ever executed, not for rebellion, but for burglary. But this was a warning call to the Articles of Confederation Congress that the government wasn't strong enough. It didn't have an executive, it didn't have a military, it couldn't react quickly enough or raise money quickly enough. This was seen by a group called the Nationalists as evidence that the Articles were weak. The Nationalists were led by George Washington, James Madison, John Jay, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. You say, well, wait a minute, I never heard of them as nationalists. That's right, because their opposing group was called the Federalists, who wanted to maintain very strong state power. So the Nationalists pulled off one of the greatest PR campaigns in human history. They relabeled themselves Federalists, meaning their opponents were stuck with the label Anti-Federalists. And as we all know, anti-anything is not a good PR marketing device, right? And so the Nationalists managed to be called Federalists, whom we now know as George Washington, John Jay, and the rest. And those who opposed the new Constitution were called Anti-Federalists. This became the basis for the calls for a new constitutional convention in 1787, and as I mentioned, the first act was to agree to meet in secret, and their second act was to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. So it was not quite chaos and patriots to the rescue, as was the view prior to Merrill Jensen, but there were some very good points about the Articles of Confederation, and they should never be forgotten that in their land ordinances they made American history. I'm Professor Larry Sweikart, co-author of A Patriot's History of the United States and founder of The Wild World of History.